The measuring tape was cold in his hands. He had climbed the ridge alone that morning, following a hand-drawn map folded into the back of his grandmother's Bible. A map no one else in the family seemed to know existed. The trail was overgrown. The pines had reclaimed most of what had once been a path, and twice he had to push through walls of brush so thick they seemed to be guarding something deliberately. Then he found it. The entrance was low, half hidden by a curtain of vine and loose rock, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. He ducked inside, and the world changed. Outside, the summer heat pressed down on the mountain like a hand. Inside the tunnel, the air was still. Not cool the way a shaded room is cool. Still, even. The kind of temperature that does not shift with the time of day or the mood of the season. He held up his measuring instrument and waited. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked it twice, then a third time. He moved deeper into the tunnel, running his lantern along the rock walls, and that was when he saw it, carved into the stone near the back, at roughly the height of a woman's shoulder. The letters were deliberate, careful. Someone had taken time with them. For Elsa and Margaret, the earth keeps what we give it. He stood there for a long time. He searched every record he could find in the days that followed. Land registries, church rolls, settlement logs, town ledgers going back as far as the ink had survived. The tunnel appeared in none of them. The land around it had passed through several hands over the decades, but nowhere, not in a single document, was there a name attached to the construction. Nowhere was there a woman credited with building anything on that hillside at all. And yet, 16 people had sheltered inside those walls during the worst storm in the memory of anyone who had been alive to see it. 16 lives. Not one record bearing the name of the woman who had saved them. Who built this? And why had she been so thoroughly erased? That question is where this story begins. Her name was Nora. She was not yet 30 when her husband died, and the world she had known, small as it already was, became smaller still within the week. Thomas had been a quiet man, steady and deliberate in the way that men are who have grown up watching their fathers work with their hands. He had built the house himself, board by board, in the 2 years before they married. He had taught himself the joinery, the window framing, the chimney placement, by reading and by failing and by starting again. Nora had loved that about him, his willingness to begin again. She did not get the chance to begin again. Not there. Thomas's brother Wallace arrived on the 4th day after the burial, while the ground was still too frozen to have settled properly. He came in a good coat and clean boots, and he carried papers that he set on the kitchen table without being invited to sit down. The papers were legal. Nora had understood that much before she had finished reading the first page. The house had been Thomas's, and Thomas had not left a formal will, and the law in those years and in that place was not a friend to widows. Wallace said what the papers meant, in case the language was unclear. He said it with Elsa standing in the doorway. Elsa was 8 years old, and she had not spoken more than a handful of words since the day her father had been carried inside and laid on the bed and had not gotten up again. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen in her nightgown and her bare feet, and she looked at her uncle, and she looked at her mother, and she did not say anything at all. "You were a guest in this house," Wallace said. "Guests leave when they're told." Nora did not argue. She had learned, in the years of watching, of listening, of understanding how the world moved around women who did not have money or title, or a man standing beside them. That argument used energy she could not afford to spend. She would need every ounce of what she had left. She packed what she could carry. Elsa's winter coat, 2 sizes too large because Nora had bought it that way on purpose, knowing children grew faster than money came in. Margaret's sewing kit, the one that had belonged to Margaret's mother before her, the cooking pot, the blankets, a small tin of flour, another of salt, and at the very bottom of the bag she packed last, tucked inside the cover of Thomas's old geology textbook, the one he had studied from when he was apprenticed to the surveyor, the one whose spine was cracked from years of use, a sealed envelope. Thomas had pressed it into her hands the week before he died, when the fever had taken enough of him that words were difficult, but intention was still clear. "Don't open it unless you need to," he had said. She had not opened it. She did not know yet what was inside. She only knew it was the last thing his hands had touched with purpose, and she was not ready. She would not be ready for a long time. They traveled west in the company of a supply wagon whose driver asked no questions and offered no charity beyond the space on the bench, which was enough. Margaret rode with her eyes forward and her hands folded in her lap and said very little. Elsa sat between them and said nothing at all. The mountains appeared on the 3rd day, first as a rumor on the horizon, then as a wall, then as something so large that Nora stopped thinking of them as scenery and began thinking of them the way her father had taught her to think about the earth, as a system, as something with its own logic. Her father had been a miner. Not the laboring kind, but the reading kind, the kind who went down into the dark with a notebook as well as a lamp and came back up with theories as well as ore. He had grown up in the mining valleys of Wales and brought that knowledge west when he came. And he had given it to Nora the way other fathers gave daughters embroidery patterns and recipes. He had given her the earth. "Rock doesn't borrow cold from the air," he had told her once, crouching beside a cut in the hillside, pressing his palm flat against the exposed stone. She had been perhaps 12, unimpressed by geology, more interested in the birds overhead. "It keeps whatever temperature it started with. That's not a small thing, Nora. That's the difference between freezing and surviving." She had filed that away. The kind of knowledge you store without knowing you are storing it, because it does not feel useful yet. Now, 20 years later, she understood. The town was called Stonewell, and it was the kind of small mountain settlement that existed in those years like punctuation marks in a very long sentence. A general store, a church, a blacksmith's forge, a scattering of cabins, and approximately 25 people whose business it was to know everyone else's. They watched Nora climb down from the wagon with her mother, her daughter, her mule Cedar, and her 2 bags of belongings, and they formed opinions before she had taken 10 steps. She did not have time for their opinions. She had a week before the cold deepened. She had less than that before her small reserve of money ran out entirely, and she had seen, on the ridge above the north end of town, the dark mouth of an old mine tunnel, abandoned, by the look of it, for years. She climbed up that same afternoon, while Margaret rested and Elsa sat silently beside Cedar and braided the mule's forelock with the focused attention of a child who needs something small to do with her hands. Nora ducked inside the tunnel entrance and stood still. The air was cold, but it did not move. That was the thing. It did not move. Outside, the October wind was the kind that found every gap in your coat and settled into your collar and worked its way down. Inside the tunnel, nothing found anything. The cold was complete, yes, but it was static. Sealed. The kind of cold that would yield to a small, steady fire the way a room yields to a lamp. Not swinging with the wind. Not running away when you tried to hold it. She stood there a long time. She ran her hand along the rock wall. She thought about her father, crouching in the Welsh hillside, pressing his palm to stone. It keeps what it starts with. She walked back to the entrance and looked down at the town. A few people had noticed her going up. She could see, even from the ridge, that they were watching. Let them watch. She walked back to where Margaret and Elsa were waiting. Elsa looked up. "Can we really live here, Mama?" Nora crouched down so that she was level with her daughter's eyes. 8 years old, and so careful, so quiet, holding everything inside the way her mother had taught her without meaning to. "Your grandfather taught me everything I need to know," Nora said. "And I'm going to teach it to you." Elsa considered this for a moment. She did not smile, but something in her face shifted, just slightly, like a door that has been stuck for a long time, moving half an inch in its frame. It was enough. Nora stood up, took the mule's rope in one hand and her daughter's hand in the other, and started up the ridge toward the dark mouth of the tunnel that was about to become their home. Behind them, the town of Stonewell watched and said nothing. It would have a great deal to say before the winter was over. The first night inside the tunnel, none of them slept. Margaret lay on the folded blankets with her eyes open, watching the candle flame bend and straighten in currents of air that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Elsa curled against her grandmother's side with her knees drawn up and her hands pressed together between her cheek and the blanket, the way she had slept since she was very small. Cedar was tied at the tunnel entrance, shifting his weight in the dark, occasionally blowing through his nose at some smell or sound that the women couldn't identify. Nora sat with her back against the rock wall and her notebook open on her knee and drew diagrams by candlelight. She drew the tunnel as she understood it, the long throat of it, running perhaps 40 feet into the hillside, the ceiling vaulting slightly higher toward the middle before dropping again near the back. She sketched the entrance and thought about what happened to warm air when it met cold air and where the cold air would come from and where it would go. She thought about her father's notebooks, which she had memorized more thoroughly than she had ever memorized anything taught to her in a schoolroom. She thought about the way he had described a mine's interior in winter. "The rock is not cold, Nora. The rock is neutral. Cold is the absence of heat. The rock simply refuses to give it up once it arrives." She drew a line where she would build the first wall. Then she drew a second line closer to the tunnel entrance and studied the space between the two lines for a long time. A buffer. A room between the outside world and the inside world. A place where the mountain air and the living air could negotiate terms without either one winning completely. She wrote in the margin, "This is how it works. Not by fighting the cold, by refusing to let it all the way in." She was not certain it would work. She was certain she had no other option. The cold came in earnest on the third night. It had been merely uncomfortable before. The sharp, declarative cold of early mountain autumn, the kind that announces itself honestly and retreats by midday. This cold was different. It came in through the tunnel entrance and spread along the floor like water, finding every low place, every gap, every space where a body had not yet warmed the stone beneath it. Margaret woke coughing. She had been reaching for something in her sleep, and she had rolled, and her right hand had gone out to catch herself on the tunnel floor, and the angle was wrong. Nora heard the sound before she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. Not a break. But something shifted or strained in the old bones of the wrist that would not heal cleanly or quickly, and that would take Margaret's right hand out of anything useful for longer than they could afford. Nora wrapped it without speaking. Margaret did not make a sound while it was being wrapped. She sat very straight and looked at the tunnel wall and breathed steadily through her nose. "I can still hold things," she said when it was done, "as long as you don't need me to grip them." "I'll need you to tell me when I'm doing something wrong," Nora said. "That's more useful anyway." Margaret looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Something between grief and pride and exhaustion, too old and too layered to have a simple name. "Your father would agree with that," she said. Then the rain came. It came without ceremony, the way mountain rain arrives, not building gradually but simply present, full and committed, driving in through the tunnel entrance in a cold mist that reached further than it had any right to reach. Nora had set the matches in the tin box on the highest ledge she had managed to construct, a rough platform of stacked stones that she had thought was sufficient. It was not sufficient. The mist was patient. By the time she reached for the matchbox, the thin sticks inside were soft with damp. She held one up and looked at it. Then she sat down on the floor of the tunnel and thought about what her father had done when the matches were wet, and she did not reach for the box again. She reached instead for the leather pouch she kept at the bottom of the second bag, the one that contained, among other things, a piece of quartzite the size of her palm, and a strip of hardened steel that had belonged to her father and before him to his father, a fire striker, old enough that the steel had a patina that spoke of years and hands, heavy enough that holding it felt like holding the memory of competence. She had never done this herself. She had watched her father do it twice, once by firelight and once in a mine shaft with no light at all. And she had watched with the specific attention of someone who believes they are memorizing something they will never need. She needed it now. The quartzite, the steel, the angle, the tinder. She had dry moss in a cloth pouch, dry enough from the protection of 2 layers of canvas. She built the nest carefully. She struck. Nothing. She adjusted the angle, struck again. A spark. Gone before she could register it. She struck again and again, her wrist aching, her fingers growing clumsy. And Elsa sat across from her in the near dark and watched with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who understands that something important is happening and knows that speaking would break it. Margaret had her eyes closed. Whether she was praying or simply conserving warmth, Nora could not tell. The sparks came in small storms and died. And then, on a strike that felt no different from the 40 that had preceded it, the tinder caught. A fragile, improbable thread of smoke, a curl of orange at the edge of the moss. Nora bent and breathed on it with the precise, controlled breath her father had described, not blowing, but coaxing, and the coal became a flame, and the flame found the kindling she had set around it, and the light expanded into the tunnel like something that had been waiting for permission. Elsa let out a long, slow breath. Then she crossed the tunnel floor on her knees and put her small hand on Nora's arm. She didn't speak. She simply rested her hand there, warm and deliberate. And then she said, Quietly, almost to herself, the words coming out careful and considered as if she had been assembling them for some time. Papa would have been slower than you. It was the first full sentence she had spoken since the night of the funeral. Nora did not trust herself to respond. She put her hand over her daughter's and held it there, and watched the fire grow. She built the first wall on the 4th day. The timber came from deadfall on the slope above the tunnel. Not ideal wood, not the seasoned, dried lumber a proper carpenter would have chosen, but serviceable and available and free, which was the most important quality anything could have at that particular moment. Cedar hauled the heavier pieces, patient and methodical, picking his way down the slope with the unhurried gravity of an animal that has decided to be useful. The wall went up roughly 12 feet from the tunnel entrance. It was not elegant. The boards were uneven, the gaps between them wider than Nora wanted, and the frame she had notched together from 3 pieces of salvaged timber leaned slightly to the left in a way she addressed by wedging a flat stone beneath the base on the right side. A negotiation rather than a solution, but one the wall accepted. She chinked the gaps with a mixture of clay from the stream bed below, dry grass gathered from the upper meadow, and her own stubbornness, which was in plentiful supply. She packed the mixture in with a wooden tool she shaped herself from a split branch, and she worked from the bottom up, sealing each course before moving to the next, the way her father had described filling the gaps in a shaft lining. The wall had a door, low, made from 3 boards she had split with a froe she had found left behind in the tunnel by whatever miners had worked it last. Below the ceiling, she left a gap covered with a piece of oiled canvas that she could lift or drop, depending on whether she needed the air to move or to stay still. She was calculating airflow. She was not certain her calculations were right, but she was doing the best she could with what she had and what she knew, which was more than anyone in Stonewell appeared to believe she possessed. She knew this because they came to tell her so. Gideon Marsh arrived on the 5th day. He was a broad man with a beard that had gone to gray on the chin while remaining stubbornly brown at the sides, and he ran the general store with the authority of a man who controls something everyone needs. He came up the ridge trail in good boots and stood at the tunnel entrance with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at what Nora had built with the expression of someone who has been proven right about something they hadn't wanted to be right about. "Folks in town are calling it Marsh's Folly," he said. "On account of I was the one said someone ought to stop you before you hurt yourself or the child." "Then you have a convenient name already," Nora said, without stopping what she was doing. He watched her work for a moment longer. "Wall's going to lean," he said. "It's leaning now," she said. "It's holding now." He didn't have an answer for that, and he left. Reverend Albright came the following morning, which was a Sunday, and therefore the day he considered himself most credentialed to dispense judgment. He was a lean man with careful hands and the kind of face that looked as though it had been arranged rather than grown, each feature positioned for maximum gravity. He stood at the ridge's edge and spoke from there, which meant she had to raise her voice slightly to respond, and he did not. An arrangement he had clearly considered in advance. He spoke of pride, of the danger of a woman who substituted her own judgment for the guidance of those better placed to provide it. He did not say the word foolish, but he arranged several other words around its outline so precisely that the shape of it was unmistakable. "I appreciate your concern, Reverend," Nora said. If you're still concerned come February, you're welcome to discuss it then. He was not accustomed to being dismissed by a woman carrying lumber. He left. Roy Purcell and his brother Clem came together on the 7th day, which seemed to be the day the town had settled on for organized observation. They were younger than the Reverend and the storekeeper, and they had the easy confidence of men who have grown up certain that the world will continue to make sense according to the rules they already understand. They stood at the tunnel entrance for perhaps 10 minutes and talked to each other in voices just loud enough to be heard. Roy said he'd give her until the first real cold snap. Clem said he was being generous. Roy said he'd put $1 on it. Clem said he'd put 2. They both laughed, the comfortable laughter of people who are relieved to have been given a way to dismiss something that might otherwise require them to act. Nora kept working. She was building the second wall, the inner one, closer to the back of the tunnel, when she heard a different sound at the entrance. Not the heavy boots of a man arriving to a pine, something lighter, a shuffle, and then stillness. And then a sound she couldn't quite categorize, a small, dry whimper, quickly suppressed. Elsa appeared at the inner doorway a moment later, and behind her, at the approximate height of Elsa's knee, was a dog. It was not an impressive dog. It was the color of old straw, with one ear that sat higher than the other and ribs visible beneath its coat and eyes positioned at the precise angle required to produce maximum sympathy in any human being with a functional heart. It had been found, Elsa reported in the careful, quiet voice she was slowly beginning to use again, near the place where people left broken things at the edge of town. He followed me, Elsa said. Dogs do that. Nora said, Can he stay? Nora looked at the dog. The dog looked at Nora with an expression of such earnest and transparent hope that it was almost impossible to refuse without feeling like a person who kicks things that are already down. He'll eat what we eat, she said, which isn't much. He won't mind, Elsa said, with the authority of someone who had already reached an understanding with the animal in question. The dog sat down and put his chin on Elsa's foot and looked at Nora. Patch, Elsa said, as if that settled it, as if she had simply read the name off the dog the same way she read words off a page. Nora looked at them both, the thin, careful girl and the thin, hopeful dog. And she thought about all the things she did not have room for, and all the ways this was impractical and unwise. Fine, she said, but he sleeps by the door. He slept by the door for exactly one night, and after that, he slept pressed against Elsa's side with his chin on her shoulder, and no one said anything about it, because no one had the heart to. The old man arrived on the 9th day in the late afternoon when the light was going gold and thin across the ridge. He was perhaps 70, with the kind of body that had been large once and had not so much diminished as compacted. Still solid, still deliberate in its movements, but smaller than the frame suggested it had been built for. His name was Silas Drum, and he had worked mines in 3 states and 1 territory before his knees decided they had contributed enough, and he now lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of Stonewell's eastern boundary. He came up the ridge trail without announcing himself and stood at the tunnel entrance and looked at the pipe Nora had run up through a crack in the rock ceiling, the pipe she had installed 2 days earlier, bent at the top to direct the smoke outward along the cliff face so the wind would carry it away rather than push it back inside. He looked at it for a long time. "You're running the pipe wrong," he said. Nora lowered the board she was holding and turned to look at him. "Show me." He stayed for the better part of 4 hours. He did not frame it as teaching, and she did not receive it as charity. He pointed at things and she adjusted them. And he said, when the adjustment was correct and not quite when it wasn't. And by the time the light had gone completely and the cold was settling in with its evening authority, the pipe sat at an angle that would shed smoke cleanly in any wind direction, and the inner wall had a second course of clay chinking that was measurably better than anything Nora had managed alone. He packed up his tools. He had brought tools without being asked, which told her something about why he had really come, and prepared to leave. "Thank you," Nora said. He paused at the tunnel entrance. "I'm not doing it again," he said. Not unkindly, just clearly, as a man states a fact. She nodded. She understood. A man alone at the edge of a town that had already decided what it thought of her could not afford to be seen taking her side, and his coming once might already cost him something she couldn't yet measure. He had given what he could give, once quietly, and he was going to go back to his cabin and say nothing about it. "I know," she said. He left. He did not look back. But she noticed in the days that followed that the worst of the jeering stopped at roughly the time it became known, somehow through the wordless channels by which information moves in small places, that old Silas Drum had spent an afternoon on that ridge. What had changed was not their opinion. What had changed was their certainty. Inside the tunnel, things were beginning to look like something. Not like a home. Not yet. Not by any measure a person from the world below would recognize, but like a place that had decided to become one, which is a different thing and in some ways more important. The inner room held an iron stove positioned against the left wall, the pipe running up through the ceiling crack at its careful angle. There were 2 sleeping pallets made from compressed grass and covered with blankets. A low shelf of stacked stone held the tin cooking pot, the flour, the salt, a handful of dried beans that Nora had stretched across 10 days with a frugality that would have impressed people who had not witnessed it. A small mirror hung on the rock wall, Margaret's, which had been her mother's, and it caught the firelight in the evenings and multiplied it, and the multiplication of light, however slight, was something. Elsa had found a piece of slate on the slope above, and brought it inside, and propped it against the back wall, and begun, very quietly, to practice her letters on it with a nail. "For my lessons," she said, when Nora noticed. Nora looked at her daughter, at the slate, at the nail her daughter had found and repurposed for a pencil, at the careful, determined letters taking shape on the dark stone surface. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together very firmly and turned back to what she was doing. But she thought, in that moment, that the courage it takes to think about your education when you do not know if you will be warm or fed, that kind of courage was worth more than anything Gideon Marsh or Reverend Albright had ever built or said or decided about anyone. The tunnel was becoming a home. And something else was coming. Owen came on the 14th day, which was a Tuesday, and not a day that would have seemed significant for anything. He was a widower. Nora had gathered this from the peripheral information that moves through a small town around its edges, not spoken directly but present in the way people phrased certain things. He worked the blacksmith forge at the south end of town, and he was perhaps 10 years her senior, with the kind of hands that have been shaped by decades of work into something both powerful and precise. He did not appear to have a specific reason for climbing the ridge. He had a board. He said the hinge on the tunnel door needed reinforcing, and he had a board that would do it. He reinforced the hinge. It took perhaps 20 minutes. He had brought, in addition to the board, a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread that he set on the stone shelf without making any particular announcement about it, as if bread materialized on shelves through purely natural processes. He nodded to Nora and left. He came back 3 days later with another board. The other hinge, he explained, needed the same treatment. He came back 3 days after that. Elsa watched the third visit from her position near the back wall, where she was practicing her letters. She watched Owen work on something that did not appear to need working on, and she watched her mother not look at Owen with a focused attention that was, in Elsa's estimation, its own form of looking. "He comes too often to be fixing a hinge, Mama," she said when he had gone. "Hinges require maintenance," Nora said. Elsa considered this with the gravity of someone who knows they are being redirected but has not yet decided whether to press the point. She returned to her letters, but the corner of her mouth had moved. Not quite a smile. The quarter-inch opening of a door that has been stuck. It was Margaret who heard them. She had been resting. The wrist required more rest than she wanted to admit. Sitting against the inner wall with her eyes half closed while Nora worked outside, and Elsa sat with Patch at the tunnel entrance, watching the town below with the quiet attention she brought to most things now. Margaret was not fully asleep. She was in the suspended state that falls between waking and sleep, in which the body rests but the ears stay open, still listening for the sounds that mean something has changed. She heard voices from the direction of the general store, not the ordinary sounds of commerce or community. This was low and deliberate, with the quality of an agreement being reached. She heard Wallace's name. She lay still and let the words come to her without moving toward them, the way she had learned, in years of navigating the world as a woman who knew more than she was supposed to know, to receive information that wasn't meant for her. What she understood, by the time the voices stopped, was this: Wallace had sent someone ahead. Not Wallace himself, not yet, but a representative, a man with papers, and those papers claimed that the deed Thomas had left Nora was fraudulent, that it had been produced after the fact, that Thomas's signature had been, and here the voice had used a word that Margaret had to work to hear clearly, induced, under the influence of fever and confusion, and a wife who had seen an opportunity. And Gideon Marsh had agreed to sign a document supporting this claim, in exchange for something. She had not heard what. She lay still for a long time after the voices stopped. Then she got up slowly, favoring the wrist, and walked to the tunnel entrance, and looked up the ridge to where Nora was working, and watched her daughter move boards and mortar and pipe with the methodical determination of someone who has decided that the only direction available is forward. She waited until evening. She waited until Elsa was asleep, with Patch warm against her side, and the firelight settled into its low, patient rhythm, and then she sat beside Nora and told her what she had heard. Nora went very still. It was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of a person who has been braced for impact for so long that when it finally arrives, the body simply absorbs it without visible reaction, like stone absorbing cold. She sat for a long time without speaking. Then she reached for the bag, the second bag. She took out the geology textbook and she removed the sealed envelope from inside the front cover, and she held it in both hands and looked at it. She thought about burning it. She sat in the firelight and thought about what it would mean to put it in the stove and watch it go. The threat it represented, gone. Wallace would have no reason to pursue her then. She could stay here, in this tunnel, in this peace she was carefully building, and perhaps they would leave her alone. Her hands tightened around the envelope. She thought about Thomas, about the week before he died, when he had pressed it into her hands with what was left of his strength and said, "Don't open it unless you need to." She did not burn it. Margaret, who had been watching with her eyes almost closed, reached over with her good hand and placed it over both of Nora's. "Don't burn what Thomas loved you enough to leave behind," she said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Outside, the wind had picked up along the ridge, and somewhere below, the town of Stonewell was settling into its evening routines, its fires lit, and its opinions intact, and its certainty about this widow and her foolish tunnel as solid as it had ever been. But what the town did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the tunnel was warm, that the rock was doing exactly what Nora's father had said it would do, and the worst of it was still coming. But so was something else. So was the storm. The man from the county office arrived on a Wednesday, and Nora was halfway up the ridge with 2 full water pails when she saw him coming down from the opposite direction. He was a small man in a large coat, carrying a leather satchel with the careful attention of someone transporting something valuable. He had the look of a person who delivers unpleasant news professionally, not cruel, not sympathetic, simply efficient. He introduced himself by his office rather than his name. He represented, he said, the County Records Division. He had come to inform her that a review of the settlement registry had been completed, and that her name did not appear in it. Not incorrectly entered, not misplaced, simply absent. As far as the official record of this county was concerned, no woman of her name and description had established residency in or around the town of Stonewell. Nora set the water pails down. She asked him, calmly, how that was possible, given that she had been living on this ridge for the better part of 3 weeks and had been observed doing so by approximately 25 people who all lived within walking distance of the county office. He said that observation was not the same as documentation. He said that without documentation, residency could not be confirmed. He said that without confirmed residency, any claim she might make to land or structure in the area would be difficult. Here he paused, selecting the precise word, to support. Then he nodded once, adjusted his satchel, and went back down the ridge the way he had come. Nora stood on the trail for a long time after he had gone. The water in the pails had stopped rippling. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting a sky that had gone the color of old pewter overnight, low and pressing and entirely without warmth. She looked at it, at her own reflection, broken into 2 pieces by the handles of the pails, and she thought about Wallace sitting somewhere comfortable and dry, having paid whatever it cost to have a small man in a large coat deliver this particular message. Not hear himself, never hear himself. That was the thing about Wallace. He operated through instruments, through papers and representatives and signed documents and people who owed him something. He had done it when he arrived at the house the week after Thomas died. Not violent, not dramatic, just legal, just inevitable, just the quiet application of systems that had been designed, long before either of them were born, to produce exactly this outcome. She picked up the pails and continued up the ridge. When she told Margaret what had happened, Margaret listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He paid someone to remove your name." That's what it amounts to. Then he planned this before he sent the papers. This wasn't a response to your staying. This was prepared. Yes, Nora said. Margaret nodded slowly. Then the letter matters more than we thought. Silas Drum's cabin was empty on Thursday morning. Nora had not planned to go to him. She had told herself, firmly, that she would not, that he had given what he was able to give, once, quietly, and to ask for more was to put something at risk she had no right to put at risk. But she had gone past his cabin on the way to the eastern stream bed, and the cabin door was ajar. Not open, ajar. The way a door is left when someone has gone out and expects to come back shortly. But the cold coming through the gap said the fire inside had been out for some time. She pushed the door open with her knuckle. The cabin was tidy. That was the thing that struck her first. The tidiness of someone who has arranged things deliberately before leaving, not the ordinary disorder of a morning departure. The blanket on the bed was smooth. The tools on the wall were hung in a row. The cold stove held no ash from a recent fire. There was no note. She stood in the doorway for longer than she had intended to stand there. Long enough to feel the specific weight of it. The way a person who has been your only ally can vanish from a place without explanation and leave behind a silence louder than anything they said while they were present. She pulled the door closed carefully and walked back up the ridge. Margaret's face did something complicated when she heard, "He'll have had a reason," she said finally. "I know," Nora said. "I just don't know what it is." That night, the woman came. It was late, past the hour when anyone in Stonewell moved between houses, and the sound of footsteps on the ridge trail was so unexpected that Patch was on his feet and at the tunnel entrance before Nora had fully registered what she was hearing. He did not growl. He made the low, questioning sound he made when something was unfamiliar but not threatening. And Nora took her lantern and went to the outer door and opened it. Ada Purcell stood on the trail in the dark. She was Roy Purcell's wife, a small woman, not young, with the look of someone who has spent considerable years managing a household and two opinionated men, and has become, as a result, very skilled at moving without being noticed. She was carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle and a folded blanket. She held them out without speaking. Nora took them. Ada Purcell looked at her, not unkindly, not with the performed sympathy that Nora had learned to distrust, but with the direct, clear look of one woman taking the accurate measure of another. And then she turned and went back down the ridge trail the way she had come, without a word. Nora unwrapped the bundle inside. A loaf of bread, still faintly warm. A small piece of hard cheese. A folded paper at the bottom, written in a careful, unpracticed hand. "Roy doesn't know I came. He won't hear it from me. You shouldn't be alone up here without someone knowing you're not as alone as they want you to think. No signature. None was needed." Nora folded the note and put it in the tin where she kept the things that mattered. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on her pallet in the low warmth of the banked stove and thought about what she had. She had a tunnel that was warm. She had a daughter who was slowly, carefully, returning to herself. She had a mother who was still here, still thinking, still making the observations that caught the things Nora missed. She had a piece of bread from a woman who owed her nothing and had come in the dark anyway. She had an envelope she had not opened. She had no legal existence in this county. She had no ally whose location she knew. She thought about her father, about the way he had moved through spaces that did not want him. A Welshman in an American mine. A man who read books in places where reading was viewed with suspicion, with the patience of someone who has decided that the judgment of people who don't understand something is not a useful measurement of that thing's value. She thought about what he had told her once, about navigating a shaft you didn't know well. Don't rush. Don't panic. Use what you can see to understand what you can't. The mountain tells you everything if you learn to listen to it. She had been listening. She just wasn't sure yet what it was telling her. She fell asleep near dawn, and when she woke, Elsa was already up and sitting at the tunnel entrance with Patch, and the sky outside had gone the color of a bruise. It was Patch who noticed first. He had been pacing since the previous evening, not the focused, alert pacing he did when strangers approached the ridge, but something more agitated, more internal, as if the thing disturbing him was not outside the tunnel, but in the air itself. He moved from the entrance to the back wall and back again, pausing at each end to test the air with his nose, and then moving again. Elsa watched him with the careful attention she gave to things she didn't understand. "He's not happy," she said. "No," Nora agreed. She stood at the tunnel entrance and looked at the sky. It had been wrong since the previous evening. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and said there, that is the sign, but wrong in accumulation. The quality of the light, the direction of the birds, which had been moving in a way that contradicted the wind, the pressure of the air, which her father had taught her to read through the small ache in her ears that arrived before weather changed. The clouds on the northern horizon were a color she had seen only once before, on a morning when her father had pulled her inside and nailed the shutters and told her to sit still and wait. She had been perhaps 11 then. She remembered the color. She went down the ridge that afternoon and made her rounds. The general store, 3 of the cabins at the edge of town, the church where she found Reverend Albright in conversation with 2 of the older men from the settlement's eastern claims. She said what she had observed. She said it plainly, without drama, in the same tone she had used to teach arithmetic to children who were not yet sure they needed it. She said the sky on the northern horizon indicated significant weather approaching, not ordinary winter cold, but the kind of sustained driving cold that came from the deepest part of the season and did not negotiate. She said animals were sensitive to pressure changes that human senses missed, and that Patch's behavior since the previous evening had been consistent with something large incoming. Gideon Marsh, who had come in from the back room while she was speaking, leaned against the counter. "The woman who lives in a hole in the ground," he said, addressing the room rather than her, "is now telling us about weather." There was laughter, not cruel laughter. The comfortable laughter of people who are relieved to have been given a way to dismiss something that might otherwise require them to act. Reverend Albright said that weather of the kind she described was rare in this region, and that if the Almighty intended it, they would meet it as they had met every previous trial, with prayer and with the resources they had prudently laid in. At the last cabin, a young man leaned in his doorway and said, with the inventiveness of someone proud of their cleverness, "Better get back to your hole, tunnel woman. Looks like sunshine to me. She walked back up the ridge in the failing light. She closed the tunnel door with the same care she always used, because the hinge was reinforced now, but still required respect. And she was not going to damage something she had built simply because she was angry. She was angry. She sat with it for a while, in the outer cold room where the temperature was uncomfortable enough to feel appropriate. And she let the anger be what it was. Not dangerous, not useful in the way that action was useful, but real, and worth acknowledging rather than pushing into a corner where it would fester. Then she went inside, checked the wood supply, reviewed the food stores, assessed the structural integrity of every joint and seal she had put into the walls over the past 3 weeks, made the repairs and reinforcements that needed making, moved the water supply inside, and confirmed that the canvas over the ceiling gap was properly secured. She did what she could do. The storm came in the night. It did not announce itself gradually. It arrived at the speed of intention, not building from a distance, but simply present, suddenly and completely, as if it had been waiting just outside the edge of perception and had chosen its moment. The sound was the first thing, not the sound of wind exactly, or not the wind Nora had known before, the ordinary winter wind that pressed against walls and found gaps and whispered its cold complaints through every imperfection in construction. This was something else. A sustained driving roar that occupied every frequency at once, a sound that seemed to come not from any direction but from all of them simultaneously, as if the air itself had decided to stop being air and become something more deliberate. The tunnel entrance held, the outer wall held, the inner door, with its reinforced hinge and its careful seal of clay and grass, and Nora's considered attention, held. Inside the inner room, the temperature was 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, in the world that had been Stonewell 3 hours ago and was now something else entirely, something white and absolute and without feature or boundary, the temperature was doing things that Nora's father had described in theoretical terms and that she was now experiencing in real ones. Elsa woke when the sound changed and sat up and looked at the door with wide eyes. "It's here," she said. "It's here," Nora confirmed. "And we're in here." Elsa looked at the stove, at the warm light, at Patch, who had stopped pacing and was now lying pressed against the inner wall with his chin on his paws, as if he had decided, now that the thing he'd been warning them about had arrived, that his job was done and he could rest. She lay back down and pulled the blanket to her chin. "Mama," she said. "Yes." "Is everyone else okay?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I hope so." It was the honest answer. It was not the comforting one. But Elsa had stopped accepting comfort in place of honesty some time before her father died, and Nora had learned to respect that. "Okay," Elsa said, and closed her eyes. Margaret was awake. Nora could tell by the quality of her stillness. It was the conscious stillness of someone listening rather than the unconscious stillness of sleep. "Bad," she said without opening her eyes. "Yes," Nora said. "Did anyone listen?" "No." Margaret made a small sound, not quite a sigh. Something older and more considered than a sigh. The sound of someone who has lived long enough to have seen this pattern enough times to have stopped being surprised by it, while not quite managing to stop being saddened by it. "Then we'll have company before morning," she said. Nora looked at the door. She thought about the town below. about the cabins built from green timber with gaps stuffed with rags and moss, about the church with its tall windows and its certainty. She thought about what her father had said about people, which he had talked about less often and more carefully. Most people aren't cruel, he had told her once. They're just more comfortable being wrong than they are being uncertain. Certainty feels like safety. That's why they protect it even when it isn't true. She thought about Gideon Marsh's face when he said hole in the ground. Not cruel, comfortable. She thought about what the night was doing to his comfort right now. She put another piece of wood in the stove. Not a large piece. She was managing the supply carefully, because the storm might last a day or might last 3. And she sat down beside it and held her hands to it and listened to the world outside come apart. And then, at the deepest part of the night, the part where the dark is most absolute and the cold has made itself most known, there was a sound at the tunnel entrance. Not the storm. Something within the storm. Something knocking. Patch lifted his head. Nora stood. She went to the inner door and then the outer door, and she opened it against the force of the wind, which required both hands and most of her weight. And on the other side of the entrance, pressed into the small shelter created by the rock overhang above the tunnel mouth, were 3 people. A man. A woman. A child of perhaps 7 or 8, held against the woman's body with both arms, the child's face buried in the woman's coat. The man's face was the color of something that has been outside too long. Not red, past red, a grayish white that Nora recognized from her father's descriptions of what cold did to skin when it had been working on it long enough. She knew them, the Harmon family, from the cabin closest to the ridge trail. She stood aside. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." They came in, all 3 of them, and she closed the door behind them with both hands. There was always, in a storm of sufficient severity, someone else. Gideon Marsh arrived 40 minutes after the Harmons, with his wife and their 2 boys, the older one carrying the younger because something had happened to the younger boy's foot in the scramble across the slope. His wife touched Nora's arm as she came past and said nothing, and the touch said more than words would have. Reverend Albright arrived an hour after that, alone, his coat inadequate for what the night had become. The church's eastern window had failed, he said. The cold inside was not survivable. He looked at the tunnel, at the walls, at the stove, at the people arranged around it in various states of cold and relief. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Forgive me." Not to Nora specifically, to the room, to whatever accounting he was keeping in the privacy of his own conscience. Nora nodded. She moved a pallet to make room. Roy Purcell came with Ada and their 2 youngest. Ada caught Nora's eye when she came through the door, and her look said several things at once. "I'm sorry. I'm not surprised. I'm glad you're here." And Nora received it without comment. Clem Purcell came alone. He was wet to the skin and shaking, and he stood in the outer room, looking at the inner door, as if he needed to resolve something before he could walk through it. She opened it for him. He walked through. The Aldens came last. The Aldens had 2 children. The older one, a boy of perhaps 10, was on his feet, frightened but intact. The younger one, a girl of 6, was not walking. She was in her father's arms, and the color of her hands and face in the lantern light was the specific, terrible color that Nora's father had described in terms she had never wanted to have occasion to use. "How long?" Nora said, and she was already moving. The father said they had tried to wait out the first part of the storm. The cabin had held for longer than they'd expected, and then it hadn't, and the youngest had gone quiet about halfway up the trail. Nora looked at the child. She thought about her father, about the notebook page he had made her read 3 times, the one about cold, and how the body responded to it, and what you did, and what you absolutely did not do, because the thing people always did, the thing that felt right and was wrong, was apply heat too quickly to a body that had been cold too long. "Water," she said, "not hot, warm, the warmth of a hand, not the warmth of a fire." She gave the instructions clearly, to the father and to Ada Purcell, who had moved to help before being asked. She kept her voice steady. She kept her hands steady. The child's name, she learned, was Clara. And then, at the precise moment when the tunnel was as full as it had ever been, 16 people in a space built for 3, the air close and warm and lit by the single patient flame of a well-managed stove, Nora's eyes went to the bag on the far wall. The second bag, the one with the geology textbook, the one with the sealed envelope tucked inside the front cover. It had shifted. She had not touched it. She crossed the room, stepping carefully around the people arranged across every available surface, and she reached for the book. The envelope was still sealed. But beneath the book, half slipped from the bag's interior pocket, was a piece of paper she had not put there. She recognized the handwriting before she recognized the letter. It was Thomas's. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and the tunnel noise around her, the coughs and murmurs and the child's uneven breathing and the wind outside doing what the wind was doing, went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with actual sound. She opened it. "Nora," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you survived. I always knew you would." She read it slowly. She read it in the firelight while 16 people filled the space her father's knowledge had built, while the storm pressed against walls that held, while the mountain did what her father had always said the mountain would do. It kept what they had given it. The letter told her everything Thomas had known about Wallace and the land, and why he had hidden the deed, and what he had feared would happen after he was gone. It told her that the deed was real and properly witnessed, and that there was a copy, a second copy, in the keeping of a man whose name Thomas had written at the bottom of the page. A man in a town 2 days south, who Thomas had trusted with the information before the fever took his clarity away. She folded the letter. She looked at the room, at the people who had called her foolish, at the people who had called this place a hole, at the child named Clara, who was breathing more steadily now, whose color was coming back by degrees, who was alive because the mountain had kept what Nora had given it. She felt many things at once, standing there, letter in hand, in the warm center of a storm that was taking apart everything that had not been built carefully enough. She did not feel any version of satisfaction. She felt the weight of what the night was costing, even as she felt the warmth of what it had preserved. Both things, simultaneously, without resolution. That was the truth of it. And the night was not over yet. The night was long in the way that only certain nights are long, not in hours, which passed as they always did, but in the density of what each hour contained. 16 people in a space built for 3. The air was close and layered with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke and the human warmth that accumulates when bodies are near enough to one another that the heat they generate becomes a shared resource. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable, but it was survivable. And survivable was the only measure that mattered tonight. Nora moved through the space methodically, without wasted motion, assessing and adjusting with the quiet competence of someone who has spent weeks learning to read what a space needs and provide it before the need becomes a crisis. She repositioned the remaining blankets twice, redistributing them according to who was coldest rather than who had arrived with them. She fed the stove in small, precise increments, calculating the wood supply against what the night still had ahead of it. She checked Clara Alden every 20 minutes. The child's color was coming back. Not quickly. There was nothing quick about the process Nora was managing, which was precisely the point. Her father's notebook had been unambiguous. The body returning from serious cold required patience, required gentleness, required the kind of warmth that arrived slowly enough that the recovering system could accept it rather than be shocked by it. A hand pressed to a cheek. Water no warmer than a comfortable bath. Time. Ada Purcell sat beside Clara through most of it, doing what Nora directed without comment or question, with the focused competence of a woman who has managed difficult situations in small spaces and knows that the most useful thing she can offer is steady, quiet attention. The child's father sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his hands on his knees and watched his daughter breathe. At some point during the second hour, Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling of the tunnel, at the stone above, with its cracks and shadows and the pipe running through it at its careful angle. And she looked at Ada and she looked at Patch, who had arranged himself against her side and was watching her face with the focused concern of a creature who takes his responsibilities seriously. "Dog," Clara said. The word came out thick and slow, like something retrieved from a great distance. "His name is Patch," Elsa said from her position nearby. She had not moved from the back wall in hours, had been sitting there watching everything with her careful, absorbing attention. But she said this without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to introduce them. Clara looked at Elsa. "Can I pet him?" "He likes it," Elsa said. "He leans into it." Clara moved her hand, slowly, with effort, and Patch moved his chin from her side to beneath her palm and leaned, exactly as described. Something in the room shifted, not a dramatic shift. The kind that happens in the quality of air when people who have been holding their breath without realizing it are given permission to release it. Clara's father put his face in his hands, the compressed, silent release of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for several hours and has just been told he can set it down. Ada Purcell kept her hand on Clara's arm and closed her eyes. Nora watched it all from near the stove, and she thought about what her father had said about the difference between heat and warmth. Heat was a quantity. Warmth was a quality. The tunnel had heat. What the room had now was something else. The warmth that comes from people who have been afraid together and are, slowly and carefully, becoming less afraid together. She had not planned for this. She had planned for the cold, for the structural requirements, for the wood and the water and the food and the physics. She had not planned for 16 people in her home. She had stopped thinking of it as anything else. Becoming, overnight and by necessity, something that resembled a community. Wallace arrived sometime in the deepest part of the night. She heard him before she saw him, heard the knock at the outer door, which was different from the earlier knocks, more controlled, less desperate. The knock of a man who has not yet abandoned his sense of his own authority, even in circumstances that should have dismantled it. He stood in the entrance overhang, pressed back against the rock, soaking wet in a coat that had been expensive before the storm had its way with it. His face was controlled, the careful, arranged face he always wore. But the control was effortful in a way it usually was not. The cold had been working on him. He looked at her. She looked at him. She thought about the letter folded in the tin where she kept the things that mattered, about Thomas's handwriting, about what Thomas had known and written down and trusted her to find when she needed it. She stood aside. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came in. He did not say anything. He moved into the inner room and found a space along the wall. Not the best space, not the space closest to the stove, because those were already occupied by children and elderly people and a woman with a damaged wrist. And he lowered himself to the floor with the careful motion of a person whose body is colder than they are willing to acknowledge. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. The room spoke for itself. The warmth of it, the stability of it, the children sleeping along one wall and the adults arranged around them, the stove doing its quiet, consistent work, the rock walls giving back what they had been given. He sat in the middle of all of it, the man who had arranged for her name to be removed from every document in the county, and the mountain that she had learned to understand did not distinguish between people who deserved its warmth and people who did not. It kept what you gave it. That was all. That was the whole of it. Roy Purcell came and sat beside Nora near the stove at some point past the middle of the night. Not close. There was a respectful distance in his positioning, but deliberately. He looked at his hands for a while. "The bet was $2, he said finally. "Clem's too, and mine." She waited. "I watched you carry timber up that ridge for 3 weeks, and I thought it was—" He stopped. Started again. He was a man who dealt in certainties and was finding the language of error unfamiliar and uncomfortable and persisting with it anyway. "I was wrong. About what you could do. About what you knew." He said it to his hands rather than to her, but he said it. "Thank you," Nora said, simply, without the weight of what it had cost to earn this acknowledgement, because adding that weight would not help either of them, and the night had already asked enough of everyone. He nodded. He got up and went back to the other side of the room. Clem Purcell, from his position against the far wall, had been listening. He didn't say anything, but he met her eyes when she looked in his direction, and held them for a moment, and looked away first. It was not an apology. It was something less than that, and she accepted the less than, because it was offered honestly. And honesty in small amounts from people unaccustomed to it was worth more than grand gestures from people for whom it cost nothing. It was in the quietest part of the night, the hour before dawn, when even the storm had found a lower register, still present, still formidable, but no longer screaming, that Elsa did the thing Nora would remember longest. The Harmon boy, the one who had arrived with his parents in the first wave of knocking, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, a solemn child with a sharp face, had been awake for most of the night, not visibly distressed, just awake, watching, processing in the way that certain children process things, thoroughly and silently. Elsa crossed the room and sat beside him. She didn't ask permission. She simply assessed where he was and went and sat beside him with the directness of someone who has lost the luxury of comfortable indirection. She had her slate with her. She handed it to him. He looked at it, then at her. "What's the hardest thing you know how to spell?" she asked. He thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. "Necessary," he said finally. "Two C's, or one. I can never remember." "Two," she said. "One collar, two socks. That's how you remember." She showed him. He tried it. He got it right. They worked through 4 more words before he fell asleep against the wall with the slate in his lap. And Nora watched the whole of it from her position near the stove and thought about the courage her daughter was carrying. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind that shows up in the middle of the night in the coldest hour of the year and offers a person a way to think about something other than what frightens them. "Your grandfather taught me everything I need to know," she had told Elsa, on the ridge, on the day they found the tunnel, "and I'm going to teach it to you." She had not anticipated that Elsa would take that inheritance and begin immediately distributing it to strangers. She should have. She should have anticipated exactly that. Owen came to sit beside her just before the light changed. He had been on the far side of the room for most of the night, useful in the quiet, practical way he was always useful, helping with the repositioning of heavier people when circulation was a concern, keeping the outer door seal checked against the storm's attempts to compromise it, splitting the last of the larger wood pieces into sizes appropriate for the stove without being asked. He had not needed direction. He had simply identified what needed doing and done it. He settled beside her with the ease of someone who has decided to stop calculating the appropriate distance. They sat together for a while without speaking. The fire between them and the room between them and the storm. "Your wife," Nora said finally. Not a question exactly. A space she was opening. He was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago. Fever. Same as Thomas. She nodded. "The forge kept me going," he said. "Having something to do with my hands. Something that required the next thing and the next thing after that." He looked at his hands. "I think you understand that." "Yes," she said. They were quiet again. Outside, the storm had dropped another degree in volume. The way very large things exhaust themselves gradually rather than all at once. His hand was resting on the tunnel floor beside her. She was aware of it in the way she had become recently and unexpectedly aware of him as a presence. Not intrusively, not dramatically, but with the steady, quiet awareness of something that has been present for a while and has only just been noticed for what it is. She turned her hand over. He looked at it. Then he placed his hand over hers, warm and careful. And they sat like that in the dark, while 16 people breathed around them and the mountain held its warmth, and the storm did what storms eventually do. They wound down. They spent themselves. They passed. The light came in through the gap at the top of the outer wall as a thin gray line that deepened slowly to something that could charitably be called morning. Nora was awake. She had not slept at all. She felt instead the clarity that comes to a body that has been running on necessity for so long, that necessity has become a kind of fuel. Margaret was awake too. She lay on her pallet with her eyes open and her good hand resting on her wrapped wrist, watching the ceiling of the tunnel come slowly visible as the light grew. "The fever's gone," Margaret said. Nora looked at her. "What fever?" "Mine," Margaret said simply. She had not told Nora she had been feverish. Nora had not known. She looked at her mother, at the face that was tired and pale but clear in a way that it had not been entirely clear in recent days, and felt the complicated love of a daughter who realizes the person protecting her has been protected from the knowledge of how much protection was required. "Mama," she said. "I'm fine," Margaret said. "I would have told you if I wasn't." "Would you?" A pause. Eventually, Elsa's voice came from the back wall. "Mama, look." She was pointing at the gap at the top of the outer wall, at the light coming through. Not gray now, not the bruised non-color of the storm's long night. Something else, something that moved differently, that had a quality to it that spoke of a sky that had cleared enough to allow the sun, winter weak but present, to reach the ridge. "It's over," Elsa said. The words fell into the room quietly. They moved through it. Clara Alden opened her eyes and looked at the light. Roy Purcell sat up and pressed his palms against his face. Reverend Albright was already awake, sitting with his back straight and his hands folded and his eyes open, conducting some private accounting in the silence of his own conscience. He looked at the light in the gap. His face did something complicated. 16 people, he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular. Accounting. "Yes," Nora said. He looked at her. The arranged face was still there. Would probably always be there. Was too much a part of how he moved through the world to be dismantled by a single night. But something behind it was different. Something that had cost him. "The earth kept what was given it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." Wallace was the last to wake. He woke slowly, in the way of someone whose body needed the sleep more than his pride wanted to admit. And he sat for a moment reconstructing his position. The room assessed him back. 16 people, and the weight of the night between all of them, and the warmth that had held through it, and the tunnel that should not have worked and had. He looked at Nora. She was across the room, near the stove, checking the wood supply and calculating what remained against what the day might still require. She was aware of his look. She did not stop what she was doing. He reached into his coat, the inner pocket, the one that held the things he considered essential regardless of circumstance. He took out a piece of paper, creased now, slightly damp at the edges from the wet of his coat, but intact. And he looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her again. She crossed the room and took it from him. It was a single piece of paper in his own handwriting. His hand, she recognized it, had seen it on the documents he'd set on Thomas's kitchen table the week after the burial. And it said, in plain language without legal phrasing or formal structure, that the deed Thomas had given her was legitimate and that all previous claims to the contrary were withdrawn. He had not signed it yet. He held out the pen he had also retrieved from his coat pocket. She watched him sign it. He capped the pen and put it away and stood. He picked up his coat from the floor and put it on. "We are done," Nora said. He looked at her one more time. Something moved through his face that she could not entirely read and did not try very hard to. Then he walked to the tunnel entrance and through it and out into the pale, exhausted morning. She stood in the tunnel entrance for a moment after he had gone, her hand still on the door. The morning was pale and very cold, and entirely without drama. The mountain looked the same as it always had. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back inside. She turned back to the room, to the 16 people slowly waking. to Elsa sharing her slate with Clara, who was sitting up now and fully present, to Margaret watching the light with a small private expression, to Owen, who caught her eye across the room and held it for a moment with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. And she folded the paper and put it in the tin where she kept the things that mattered. Outside, the mountain was still. The storm had taken what it came to take and left. The world below was changed in ways that would take time to fully measure. But the tunnel was warm. It had held, and the earth had kept, through the longest night any of them would remember, exactly what had been given to it. The morning after the storm was very quiet. That was the first thing, the quality of the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a winter morning, which had its own sounds beneath it, the creak of settling wood and the distant movement of birds and the small negotiations of wind through branches. This was the silence of a world that had been rearranged. The storm had taken the familiar acoustic landscape of the ridge and replaced it with something new, something that had not yet found its voice, and the result was a stillness so complete it felt almost sacred. Nora stood at the tunnel entrance in the early light and looked down at Stonewell. The town was damaged. She could see it from the ridge. The Marsh store's back room had lost its roof entirely. 2 of the eastern cabins had structural failures visible even at this distance, walls leaning into themselves in the defeated posture of things that have been asked to hold more than they were built to hold. The church stood, but the eastern window was simply gone, a dark rectangular absence in the white wall. The snow was deep, deeper than any winter she had seen before. The landscape had the quality of something permanent, as if the mountain had decided to be something other than what it had been. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she went back inside and helped people wake up. They left in groups through the morning. The Harmons first, the father having assessed the trail and declared it passable with care. Then Roy and Ada Purcell with their children, Roy pausing at the tunnel entrance and turning back. Nora thought he was going to say something more fully formed, but what he did instead was extend his hand. She shook it. He nodded and left, Ada touching her arm again in passing. The same touch as the night before. The one that contained more than touch usually does. Gideon Marsh lingered. His wife had taken the boys ahead down the trail, and he stood in the outer room with his hat in his hands. "The paper I signed," he said finally. "Wallace's man came with money and a story, and He stopped. "I knew the deed was real. Thomas was a careful man. He didn't do things carelessly." Another stop. "I did it anyway." She waited. "I'll go to the county office," he said. "I'll tell them what I signed was false. Have it struck from whatever record it was entered in. If there's anything else that needs doing on that side, I'll do it." It was not a small thing he was offering. It would cost him, in the currency of small-town reputation, more than he was perhaps fully calculating, but the offer was genuine. "Thank you," she said. He put his hat on and left without looking back, which was, she had come to understand, simply how he moved through things that were difficult. Reverend Albright was last of the adults. He stood in the tunnel entrance in the morning light, and he looked at the construction around him, at the walls and the careful chinking, at the pipe running through the ceiling crack, at the inner door with its reinforced hinge, with the expression of a man seeing something clearly for the first time that he had only ever looked at before. "I preached 3 Sundays about the danger of pride," he said. about the folly of a person who substitutes their own judgment for the guidance of those more. He stopped. I was describing you to a room full of people as a cautionary example. I know, Nora said. It was my pride I was describing, he said, not yours. He looked as though this understanding had arrived recently and with some force. There is a man, he said, more slowly. Old Fielding. Lives alone on the Eastern Claim. Hasn't come to services in 2 years because his legs trouble him. He didn't come here last night. A pause. I don't know if anyone checked on him. The words landed in the tunnel entrance and stayed there. Nora looked at him. I'll go, she said. I'll go with you, he said. I know where he lives. They found him. He was alive, barely, in the way that barely is its own kind of miracle when the alternative has been present all night. He had survived in his cabin because he had spent the first hours of the storm feeding everything he owned that would burn into the fireplace. The cabin had held. The fire had held. He had held, wrapped in everything left in the house that could wrap, on the floor in front of the hearth. He was cold. He was frightened. He was angrier than Nora had expected. The anger of a person who has been alone in something terrifying and has no one to give the anger to except the first people who appear. She let him be angry. She worked while he was angry. Warming water, checking his hands and feet, wrapping what needed wrapping. Reverend Albright sat with him and said very little, and did not attempt to reframe the experience into something it was not. By the time they left, Old Fielding was drinking warm broth and had run out of anger and replaced it with a trembling quietness that was its own kind of recovery. Walking back up the ridge, Nora did not speak for a while. Reverend Albright walked beside her, slower on the snow than she was, and she adjusted her pace without being asked. He could have died, she said. Yes, the Reverend said, simply, without the cushioning she might have expected. If someone had listened and gone to him, he would not have been alone in it. They walked. I am going to have to think, he said, for quite some time about the difference between certainty and wisdom. I had believed they were the same thing. She looked at him. They're not, she said. No, he agreed. They are very much not. But what Nora didn't know, walking back up that ridge, what none of them yet knew, was that the most unexpected part of the morning was still waiting at the top of the trail. Silas Drum came back on the second day after the storm. He came up the ridge trail in the late afternoon, and behind him, picking his way carefully through the compacted snow, was a man Nora did not recognize, younger than Silas by perhaps 20 years, with the careful, precise quality of a person for whom language is a professional tool rather than a casual one. Silas introduced him without preamble. The man had been a clerk in a county seat 2 days south, and before that had studied law, and he had come, Silas said, because Silas had gone and gotten him. Nora looked at Silas. You didn't leave because of Wallace, she said. No, Silas said. You went to find someone who could help with the legal side. You had the building side handled, he said. You didn't need me for that. He said it with the matter-of-fact quality of a man stating a simple truth, without the expectation of being thanked for it, and she understood that thanking him would make him uncomfortable, and she thanked him anyway, briefly, and he looked slightly uncomfortable, and then went and looked at the pipe installation with what seemed like genuine professional interest, as if this was why he had come. The clerk, whose name was Aldous, sat with Nora at the entrance of the tunnel and reviewed what she had, and what Thomas's letter said, and what Gideon Marsh had already agreed to do. He read carefully. He asked 3 questions, each very specific. She gave him the answers. He looked up. "The deed is legitimate," he said. "The letter corroborates it. With Marsh's retraction and a proper witness to the original document, which your husband had arranged according to this letter, there is no legal basis for any claim against it." He paused. "Your name will need to be restored to the settlement registry." "I know," she said. "That will require—" "I know what it will require," she said. "I know who to speak to and what to bring. I've had some time to think about it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that recalibrated slightly, the expression of a man adjusting his assessment of a situation he had walked into with assumptions that are proving not quite right. "Yes," he said, "I expect you have." Spring came the way spring comes to mountain places, not announcing itself with warmth, but with light first, the lengthening of days that precedes warmth by weeks, and is its own kind of gift. Nora began teaching in April, not in a schoolroom. She had no schoolroom, though that would come later. She taught on the ridge and in the tunnel, and in the cleared space in front of the tunnel entrance where the first actual warmth of the season arrived earliest because of the angle of the rock face behind it. She taught whoever wanted to learn. The first student was Roy Purcell, who wanted to understand the wall construction, not for the tunnel, but for an outbuilding he was planning, and who had enough respect for what the winter had demonstrated to come, and ask properly rather than observe from the road and form theories. The second was the Harmon boy, who came because Elsa had told him there was more to learn about spelling than he had thus far encountered, and who arrived one morning with a slate of his own and a look of determined preparation. Ada Purcell came on the 3rd week, alone, while Roy was working. She did not ask about construction. She sat with Nora and asked about the method, about how you figured out what the materials you had could do, how you understood a space's properties by observation rather than by instruction. How you learned, she said, when no one would teach you. "You watch," Nora said, "and you remember what you watch, and you trust what you remember, even when someone more certain than you says it isn't right." Ada was quiet for a moment. "I've been watching a long time," she said. "Then you know more than you think?" Nora said. "That's almost always how it goes." Owen came with his proposal on a morning in late spring when the mountain had finally achieved something that deserved to be called warm, and Nora was working outside the tunnel entrance, resealing a section of the outer wall that the winter had loosened, and Elsa was 20 feet away with Patch and her slate and her ever-expanding spelling instruction to the Harmon boy. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He said he had thought about this since the night of the storm, and perhaps before the storm if he was being accurate, which he preferred to be. He said he was not asking her to stop anything she was doing or become anything other than what she was. He said he understood loss, and he understood building from what loss leaves behind. He said he thought they understood the same things about what mattered and how to work toward it. He said he would like to stay if she would have him. Nora put down the clay she was working with. She looked at him. She thought about Thomas, which she always did, and expected always would do. And she thought about the letter in the tin, and the words, "I always knew you would survive," and she thought about what survival had meant and what it was becoming, which were not the same thing at all. "Ask Elsa," she said. He turned and looked at Elsa, who had stopped pretending to work on spelling and was watching this exchange with the focused, accurate attention she brought to everything important. "What do you think?" Owen asked her. Elsa considered for a long moment. She looked at Owen with the clear, undeflectable gaze of a child who has learned that the world contains real things and comfortable things, and that these are not always the same. "Papa would have liked you," she said. "He liked people who did things properly." She returned to her slate. Patch, as if satisfied that the matter had been resolved, lay down in the sun and put his chin on his paws. Nora looked at Owen. Something in her face that had been held carefully in place for a long time eased slightly, shifted, became something more open. "Yes," she said, "you can stay." The years that followed were not without difficulty. They were years in the way that all years are, containing loss and effort and occasional reversals alongside the accumulations of small daily satisfactions that constitute a life being built rather than simply lived through. Stonewell changed, not immediately, not dramatically, but in the way that things change when an idea has demonstrated its value so concretely that people begin to incorporate it without always knowing they are doing so. 18 structures in and around the town were eventually rebuilt or supplemented using principles that Nora had first applied in the tunnel. The buffer room, the thermal mass of stone, the careful management of airflow. Not because Nora insisted on it, but because the families who had spent the worst night of the mountain's recent memory in a tunnel that stayed 49 degrees Fahrenheit had a different relationship to the concept of building than they'd had before. Roy Purcell became, in time, the person people went to when they had structural questions. He gave full credit, always, to where he had learned. His brother Clem eventually came to Nora directly and asked to learn as well, which was not quite an apology, but was perhaps the form that apology takes when it has been carried for long enough to become something more constructive. Elsa grew. She grew with the specific, unhurried intentionality of a person who has decided what they are doing and is doing it without needing approval. She taught reading to anyone who wanted it, children primarily, but also several of the older people in the settlement who had never had occasion to learn, and had been waiting for an opportunity that did not require them to feel ashamed of the wanting. She became the person that parents brought their struggling children to, and she received each child with the patience of someone who had spent a formative year learning that the right environment makes possible what the wrong one makes impossible. She wrote things down. She had always written things down. But as she grew, she wrote them down more systematically. The techniques she had learned from her mother, and that her mother had learned from her father, and his father before him. The thermal properties of stone, the management of airflow in enclosed spaces, the ways that careful observation of natural systems could compensate for the absence of formal materials. She wrote it plainly, in language anyone could read, and she intended for anyone to read it. Margaret lived long enough to see most of this. She lived to see Elsa's first students become teachers themselves, which pleased her in the way that things please people who have been waiting to see them happen without being entirely sure they would. She lived to see the tunnel declared, by an informal community consensus, something worth preserving, not as a curiosity, but as a demonstration of something that deserved to be understood and kept. She died on a winter morning in the inner room, in the warmth that had by then been accumulating in those rock walls for 2 decades. She died with Nora's hand in her good hand and Elsa's hand on her arm, and Patch, old now and slow, pressed against her side the way he had pressed against Elsa's side when he was young and she was 8 years old, and the world had just become very cold and uncertain. She said, near the end, "The rock is still warm." "Yes, Mama," Nora said. "It is." "Your father was right about that," Margaret said. "He was right about most things." "He was," Nora said. "So were you," Margaret said, and closed her eyes. They buried her in the spring, when the ground was ready, in the place she had chosen, on the slope above the tunnel, where the first warmth of every season arrived before it reached anywhere else on the ridge. Patch died the following autumn, on a warm afternoon, in the sun outside the tunnel entrance, with his chin on his paws, and his eyes half closed, and the expression of a creature that has completed what it came to do and is ready to rest. Elsa was with him. She sat beside him for a long time after, and then she went inside and came back with her slate and sat beside him and wrote his name on it. She left it there through the night. In the morning, she buried him on the slope beside Margaret, which was where he would have chosen, she said, if he had been consulted. Owen built the marker, a single flat stone set upright in the ground, and on it he carved, with the precision of someone accustomed to working with metal and heat, 2 words: "Good dog." It was enough. It was exactly enough. On a summer afternoon, many years after all of this, Nora sat on a low wooden bench outside the tunnel entrance and watched a child she loved very much climb the last section of the ridge trail. The child was 7. She had her mother's eyes, Elsa's eyes, which were Thomas's eyes, which were the steady, seeing eyes of a family that paid attention. And she arrived at the top of the trail, slightly out of breath, and immediately interested in everything around her. She looked at the tunnel entrance. "Did you really live here, Grandma?" "For many years," Nora said. "Wasn't it scary?" Nora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Every single day," she said. "I was frightened every single day for quite a long time." The child looked at her with the frank, calibrating gaze of a child processing information that doesn't match her expectations. "But you stayed?" "I stayed." "Why?" Nora looked at the tunnel entrance, at the wall she had built with boards and clay and stubbornness, at the pipe running through the ceiling that Silas had helped her angle correctly on a cold afternoon that felt, from this distance, like something from another story, at the carved words on the inside wall that she had put there years ago, when the permanence of the place had first become something she believed in enough to mark. "Because the mountain was teaching me something," she said, "and I hadn't finished learning it yet." The child thought about this. "What was it teaching you?" "That warmth doesn't come from fighting the cold," Nora said. "It comes from understanding it, from building something that works with what the earth already knows, instead of against it." She paused. "Your great-grandfather taught me that. He learned it from watching, and he taught me by showing me. And now I'm going to teach you the same way." The child's eyes went to the tunnel entrance with a new quality of attention, not the curiosity of a child looking at a strange old thing, but the attention of a student recognizing that a lesson is about to begin. "Will you teach me everything?" she asked. "Everything your great-grandfather taught me," Nora said, "which is quite a lot." She took the child's hand and stood. The sun was warm on the ridge. Below, the town that had once watched her carry timber up this slope and found it comic was quiet in the way of a summer afternoon, its 18 or so structures casting their particular shadows, several of them built with walls that held warmth the way stone holds warmth, not by fighting what comes at them, but by understanding the nature of what they're made of and working with it. She led her granddaughter into the tunnel. The temperature inside was 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Steady, even, unchanged by the summer heat pressing down on the mountain outside. The same as it had been the day she arrived. The same as it would be the day she left. The earth keeps what you give it. She had given it everything she had. And it had given it back. And given it back, and would keep on giving it back. To Elsa, and to Elsa's daughter, and to whoever came after that with enough patience and enough curiosity and enough willingness to stand in a dark space and trust what they had been taught, long after the woman who first stood in this tunnel and felt the stillness of the air and knew, with the certainty of someone who has been carrying the right knowledge for the right moment, that this was where she was going to build her home. The earth keeps what you give it. So does the heart. And so, in the end, do stories. If this one found you, if something in it felt like something you recognized, something your own hands know or your own memory holds, then it was meant for you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because some things are worth keeping alive. What the mountain gave back. It is worth saying before this story ends, what the mules grazing and the stream's clay and the deadfall timber and the rock walls all understood before any human being in Stonewell was willing to admit it. The earth does not keep score. It does not reward the deserving and punish the undeserving. It does not distinguish between the woman who built something careful and correct and the men who laughed at her for building it. When Wallace came through the tunnel entrance, soaking wet and shaking, the mountain did not close its warmth against him. When Gideon Marsh sat against the rock wall with his coat over him, the thermal mass of stone that Nora had spent 3 weeks learning to manage did not withdraw itself in judgment. It kept what had been given to it. That was all. And this is, in the end, what Nora had understood from the very beginning. Not just about stone and cold and airflow, but about the whole enterprise of building something in a place that does not yet know it needs you. You give first. You give without guarantee. You give when the giving is cold and difficult, and when the people watching you give are laughing and putting money on your failure. And then you wait, not passively. There is nothing passive about the kind of waiting that involves carrying timber and chinking walls and striking sparks from quartzite in the dark, but with the patience of someone who understands that certain things only reveal themselves over time. The rock does not warm in an afternoon. Knowledge does not transmit in a season. A community does not shift in a single storm, but it shifts. Clem Purcell came to Nora on a morning in late summer, 6 months after the storm, and asked if she would teach him what she knew about timber framing. Not Roy. Clem. Roy had come to her first, had been the first of the Purcell brothers to acknowledge that something irreversible had happened to his understanding of the world, and had carried that acknowledgement into the practical territory of asking questions and listening to the answers. But Clem had been slower. Clem had been the one who stood at the ridge's edge on the 7th day and said $2. And for Clem, the cost of being wrong had a different texture. He stood at the tunnel entrance on that summer morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now delivering a modified version that feels marginally less humiliating than the original. "I'd like to know how you did it," he said. "The walls, the heat thing." "The thermal mass," Nora said. "Whatever you call it." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who found difficulty comfortable, and this was difficult for him, and he was doing it anyway. "Come back Saturday," she said. "Bring Roy if he wants to come." He nodded and put his hat back on. "I should have," he started. She shook her head, not dismissively. More in the way that a person shakes their head when someone is about to say something that will not add anything useful to a situation that has already resolved itself. "Saturday," she said. He left. Saturday, he came back with Roy, and with young Harmon, and with a woman Nora had not met before. Ada's sister, who had a cabin 2 miles east and had been hearing, for months, about what happened on the ridge the night of the storm. She had brought a notebook. Nora looked at them all. 4 people standing in front of a tunnel entrance on a summer morning with the expectant expressions of people who have decided to learn something. And she thought about her father, crouching beside the hillside cut, pressing his palm to stone, talking to a 12-year-old who was more interested in the birds overhead. She thought about the particular patience that kind of teaching requires. She had learned it from him. Now she would give it to them. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you from the beginning." What Nora taught in that summer and in the summers that followed was not complicated. That was the thing that surprised people most. Not the principles themselves, which were strange to them, but the simplicity of the principles once they were explained. The earth is not cold. The earth is neutral. Cold is the absence of heat. And the earth, left to itself, neither creates nor destroys it. The earth simply refuses to change quickly. That refusal, that magnificent, indifferent stability, is the thing you are working with when you build into the hillside or pack your walls with stone, or design your buffer spaces to protect the interior warmth from the exterior variability. You are not fighting the cold. You are building a place where the cold cannot fully enter. This is different. Nora found herself saying this to different people in different ways over the course of several years, until she settled on the version that seemed to land most clearly. This is the difference between a person who stands in the wind arguing with it and a person who steps around the corner of a building and lets it pass. The wind does not change. The cold does not change. You change your position relative to them. Your grandfather taught you that. She did not say. He taught it to me, and I am teaching it to you, and you will teach it to someone who is not yet born, and will need it on a night you cannot predict. She did not say this, but she thought it every time. There was a night in the autumn following the storm when Nora sat alone in the inner room after Elsa and Owen were asleep, with the stove burning low and the rock walls doing what they had always done, keeping the warmth, refusing to give it up. And she opened the tin where she kept the things that mattered. The folded note from Ada. The paper Wallace had signed. The letter from Thomas. She read the letter again. Not all of it. She knew most of it by heart now, had read it enough times that the words lived somewhere behind her eyes rather than on the page. But there was a line near the end that she still needed to see, still needed the physical reassurance of the ink in Thomas's hand, rather than simply the memory of it. I could not have built what you are going to build. You always understood the earth better than I did. I just needed you to know I knew that. She sat with that for a while. She thought about all the things that had not been said between them in the years before he died. Not because they were kept secret, but because they were the kind of things you assume there is time for. Assume will be said on a better day, when there is less to manage, and more room for the saying of important things. She thought about how the hardest lesson of loss is not the losing, which is beyond your control, but the recalibration of time that follows. The understanding that the better day is today, is this ordinary morning, is this unremarkable Tuesday when everyone is tired and there is work to do, and the words feel too large for the available space. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases. She put it back in the tin. She sat for a while longer in the warmth of the tunnel that had become her home, listening to the mountain hold what it had been given, and she felt something she did not have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly, and not peace exactly, and not satisfaction exactly, but some combination of the three that is specific to people who have built something real with their own hands in a difficult place, and know that it will stand. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The last thing worth saying about Stonewell is this. Old Fielding, who had burned his furniture to survive the storm, and who had greeted Nora and Reverend Albright with the anger of a frightened man who had no one else to give it to. Old Fielding came to the tunnel the following spring, not to learn, not to apologize, not to explain. He came because his nephew had sent him 2 chickens as a late Christmas gift, and the chickens needed a place to be when the temperature dropped, and Fielding had heard that the tunnel stayed at a temperature that was survivable for chickens, and he wondered if Nora had any objection to his bringing them up. She did not have any objection. The chickens came. Elsa named them because Elsa named everything. And on some mornings that winter, when the frost was heavy on the slope and the town below was just beginning to wake, Old Fielding could be seen climbing the ridge trail with a small pail of feed, moving slowly because his legs troubled him, going to check on the chickens that were wintering in the tunnel built by the woman he had been too frightened and too proud to listen to. He never said anything about it directly. He never acknowledged, in any conversation with anyone in Stonewell, that he had arrived on the ridge the first morning after the storm at roughly the same time as Reverend Albright, and had seen what Reverend Albright had seen, and had felt what Reverend Albright had felt, and had drawn from it roughly the same conclusions. But he came every morning, and sometimes when Nora was working near the entrance, and he was leaving after checking the chickens, he would pause for a moment. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. But once, in the deep cold of midwinter, he stopped and looked at the tunnel entrance, and then looked at Nora and said, in the deliberate, considered voice of a man choosing his words with the care of someone who does not use many of them, "Smart building." Then he went back down the trail. Nora watched him go. She thought about what her father had told her, the last time she saw him before he died, when she had been perhaps 22, and had gone back to visit, and he had been older than she remembered, and had taken both her hands in his, and looked at her with the expression of a man who is trying to give someone something important before there is no more time for giving. "You see things," he had said. "Most people don't. Don't let anyone convince you that seeing things is a problem." She had thought about those words many times over the years. In the years of the marriage, when seeing things had sometimes felt like a very specific kind of loneliness, and in the weeks on the ridge, when seeing things had been the only resource she had, and in the years after, when seeing things had become something she was deliberately and carefully passing along to everyone who came to the tunnel entrance with a notebook and a willingness to learn. She thought about them now, watching old Fielding make his slow way down the trail. She thought, "Papa, look what I built." The mountain held its warmth. The earth kept what she had given it. And it was enough. More than enough. For one woman who had started with nothing but a dark tunnel and her father's voice in her memory, to have built something that would outlast her, that would be warm long after she was gone, that would keep on teaching everyone who stood inside it the same quiet, patient, essential thing. The earth keeps what you give it. So does the heart. Epilogue. Many decades passed. The town of Stonewell grew and changed the way small mountain towns do when enough of the right people decide to stay and build rather than move on to something that looks easier from a distance. The forge became a hardware concern. The general store became something larger, and the church acquired a permanent roof over its eastern window and eventually a second building beside it for the Sunday school the congregation had been discussing for years. The tunnel on the ridge above the north end of town did not change. It had been sealed and unsealed several times over the decades. There had been a period when it was used for cold storage, a period when it was simply left alone, the vines returning over the entrance and the pines reclaiming the trail and the whole structure becoming part of the hillside again in the way that things do when no one is actively preventing it. But it was never demolished, never filled, never forgotten. There were always people in Stonewell who knew what it was, who had heard the story from someone who had been there, or from someone who had heard it from someone who had, and that chain of telling was itself a kind of preservation. The woman who built the tunnel, the worst storm in living memory, 16 people, the warmth that should not have been there but was. These facts survived every retelling. And so when the man with the measuring tape climbed the ridge that summer morning, following the hand-drawn map from his grandmother's Bible, and ducked inside the tunnel entrance and felt the air change around him, still, even 52 degrees Fahrenheit, he was not the first person to stand in that space and understand that something significant had happened there. He was simply the most recent one. He read the carved words on the back wall. For Elsa and Margaret, the earth keeps what we give it. And he stood there for a long time. Then he opened his notebook. He wrote, "Tunnel structure intact. Thermal stability confirmed. Builder unknown." He paused. He crossed out unknown. He did not yet have a name. He would spend the better part of 2 years finding it, following the thread of settlement records and church rolls and the careful, systematic notes that Elsa had written and that Elsa's daughter had preserved, and that the daughter's daughter had eventually donated to a small historical collection 2 days south. But he crossed out unknown, because unknown was not the right word for what she was. She had been known to the 16 people who had knocked on that door in the dark and been let in. She had been known to the Harmon boy who learned that necessary has 2 C's on a slate in the coldest hour of a winter night. She had been known to Ada Purcell and to Silas Drum, who died knowing exactly who had built the tunnel and exactly what it had cost her to build it. She had been known to Owen, who carved 2 words on a flat stone with the precision of a man who understands that some things deserve to be done well. She had been known to Elsa, who grew up and wrote things down, and made sure that what had been given to her was given to others in turn. She had been known to a granddaughter, who climbed a ridge trail on a summer afternoon, and asked, was it scary, and received an honest answer, and learned on that afternoon that every single day is a possible beginning. The man closed his notebook and looked at the carved words one more time. He thought about his grandmother, who had drawn the map and folded it into her Bible, and never explained why, and had died before he thought to ask. He thought about the things that are carried forward without announcement, without ceremony, carried in the memories of children and the notebooks of careful women, and in the very stone of mountains that do not change. The earth keeps what you give it. He understood, standing in that tunnel with the temperature steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, that he had been given something. He intended to keep it. He intended to give it back. That, in the end, is how these things survive. Not through official records. Not through the systems designed long before any of us were born to determine what gets kept and what gets lost. Through people. Through the particular, irreplaceable, undefeatable willingness of people to remember what they have seen, and to trust it, and to carry it forward, and to tell it again and again to whoever is standing close enough to hear. The earth keeps what you give it. So does the heart. So do we, if we choose to. And that choice, that simple, daily, consequential choice, is where every story worth telling begins.